On June 18, 2018, something happened in a quiet parking lot in Deerfield Beach, Florida that would ripple through the music world for years to come. In less than half a minute, a routine afternoon turned into a violent robbery. A young man sitting inside his BMW was ambushed, shot, and robbed. The entire encounter lasted roughly 20 seconds. But here's the question that immediately arises. How does a moment that brief manage to permanently alter so many lives? How can something that happens in the span of a few breaths continue to echo for years, reshaping families, careers, and public memory? And perhaps even more importantly, what leads four individuals to believe that such an act could ever end well for them? What combination of circumstance, decision-making, and mindset turns an ordinary afternoon into a point of no return? What followed wasn't just a criminal case. It became one of the most closely watched and heavily documented trials tied to hip-hop culture in recent memory. Surveillance footage, cell phone data, social media posts, and eventually a cooperating witness all came together to reconstruct exactly what happened that day, almost second by second. 5 years later, the legal system delivered its answer. But to understand how justice unfolded, we need to understand the person at the center of this tragedy, and why his life, though short, had already made a significant cultural impact. A young artist with a complicated legacy. Jahseh Onfroy, known professionally as XXXTentacion, was born in Plantation, Florida, in January 1998 and raised in Lauderhill. His upbringing was unstable, marked by frequent transitions, emotional strain, and exposure to environments that offered little consistency. He moved through difficult family circumstances, spent time in the foster system, and experienced hardships that would later shape both his personality and his music. But here's a deeper question. How much of a person's future is written by their environment, and how much is shaped by the choices they make in response to it? From a young age, Onfroy gravitated toward music as an outlet. What began as experimentation quickly turned into something more urgent, almost like a form of emotional survival. His early recordings were raw, unfiltered, and often chaotic, reflecting a mind processing pain in real time rather than polishing it into commercial form. His music connected with millions because it felt unguarded. Songs like Sad and Jahseh Onfroy weren't just tracks, they felt like emotional confessions set to melody. Listeners weren't simply hearing music, they were hearing distress, confusion, vulnerability, and isolation expressed without restraint. By March 2018, his album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, making him one of the most influential young artists in the world at just 20 years old. But success rarely arrives without contradiction. Alongside his rapid rise came legal troubles, public controversies, and allegations that followed him into the spotlight. These elements complicated how the world viewed him. Was he an artist defined by his worst moments, or someone whose art transcended his personal struggles? And more importantly, can public admiration and public criticism truly coexist without one eventually overpowering the other? The day everything changed. On the afternoon of June 18, 2018, Onfroy arrived at Riva Motorsports, a motorcycle and watercraft dealership in Broward County. It appeared to be an ordinary stop, part of a normal day involving errands and purchases. Reports later indicated he was carrying a significant amount of cash after a bank withdrawal. But was it truly just another routine afternoon? Or was it a moment where circumstance quietly aligned into something far more dangerous? At the same time, for individuals, Michael Boatwright, Trayvon Newsome, Dedrick Williams, and Robert Allen were also in the same general area. According to later court testimony, they were associated with a group in South Florida and had already been moving through the area with intent to commit robberies. Here is one of the most unsettling turning points in the entire case. Evidence suggested they did not specifically target Onfroy in advance. Instead, they encountered him by chance. A random observation, someone with visible cash, and a rapid decision that would change everything. So the question becomes, how quickly can opportunity transform into tragedy when desperation meets impulsive judgment? Surveillance footage captured the sequence in stark clarity. As Onfroy returned to his vehicle, two masked individuals approached. The moment escalated almost instantly. There was no extended confrontation, no drawn-out exchange, just seconds of movement, hesitation, and violence. Shots were fired through the driver's side window. A Louis Vuitton bag containing cash was taken. The suspects fled in an SUV that vanished from the lot within moments. 20 seconds. That's all it took. But what can 20 seconds really destroy? And how far can the consequences stretch beyond that brief window? Onfroy was rushed to a nearby hospital, but he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. He was 20 years old. Shock, reaction, and a digital wildfire. News of the shooting spread almost immediately. Before official confirmations were even fully released, social media platforms were already flooded with speculation, grief, and disbelief. Fans struggled to process what they were hearing. Artists reacted publicly. Media outlets scrambled to verify details in real time. But while the world reacted emotionally, investigators were already doing something different. They were reconstructing. And here's a question worth considering. In an era where nearly every public space is covered by cameras, phones, and digital footprints, how long can anyone realistically expect to remain anonymous after committing a crime? In this case, the answer turned out to be, not long at all. The arrests begin. Within 2 days, investigators arrested Dedrick Williams. His identification came through a combination of surveillance footage, prior law enforcement contacts, and vehicle analysis. Early leads began forming a clearer picture of movement patterns around the crime scene. Then the case expanded beyond traditional policing. Authorities released footage to the public, asking for assistance. Suddenly, the investigation became both official and communal, thousands of eyes scrutinizing every frame. Was this the moment where modern technology began to tip the balance of justice? On July 5, Michael Boatwright was arrested on unrelated charges. While in custody, he was later served with a murder warrant connected to the case. Investigators had already begun linking him through additional evidence. One particularly notable detail came from digital forensics. His phone activity showed searches related to the case shortly after the incident. These searches were later introduced in court as part of the broader timeline of behavior. But what do such searches actually reveal? Fear, curiosity, awareness of guilt, or simply panic in the aftermath of something irreversible? There are questions that digital evidence can suggest, but never fully answer. The final arrest and a shifting case. By August 2018, Trayvon Newsome was also taken into custody, completing the group of primary suspects identified by investigators. At this point, 3 individuals were in custody, and the case had gained national attention. Yet one critical piece was still missing, a full narrative of what happened inside the vehicle and who did what in the final moments. That gap would later be addressed by Robert Allen. Facing serious charges, Allen chose to cooperate with prosecutors. In 2022, he entered a plea agreement in exchange for testimony. His decision fundamentally shifted the trajectory of the case. Why does one person choose to speak while others remain silent? Is it fear of punishment, a sense of guilt, self-preservation, or a belief that telling the truth is the only remaining option? Allen provided a detailed account of the events, identifying roles within the group and describing how the robbery unfolded step by step. His testimony helped clarify what surveillance footage could not: intent, communication, and sequence. But prosecutors didn't rely on testimony alone. They built a multi-layered case supported by surveillance video, cell phone location data, vehicle tracking, and social media evidence. In one striking detail, suspects were seen displaying cash shortly after the incident, adding further weight to the timeline established by investigators. Each piece alone might have been questioned. Together, they formed a tightly connected narrative that left little room for alternative explanations. The aftermath and unanswered reflections. As the case moved toward its conclusion, the courtroom became not just a place of legal judgment but a space where broader questions surfaced. Questions about youth, opportunity, violence, and consequence. What creates the conditions where a split-second decision feels justified? How do systems, environments, and personal choices intersect in ways that lead to irreversible outcomes? And when fame, wealth, and visibility are involved, does everything simply become amplified? By the time sentencing finally arrived, the legal outcome reflected the severity of the charges in unmistakable terms. The defendants received life sentences in connection with the murder and robbery, and the courtroom was left to absorb the weight of what those words meant. Life sentence. No release. No return. No second chance to rewrite the moment that changed everything. But even with the law having spoken, the public conversation did not end there. Why do some cases stay with people long after the verdict is read? Why do certain tragedies seem to linger in the public mind, refusing to fade into the background? Because some cases are remembered not only for what happened, but for what they expose about the world watching them. They reveal how quickly a normal day can turn irreversible. They expose how fragile life can be. And they remind people that one afternoon in a parking lot can echo far beyond the place and time where it occurred. Perhaps that is why this case continued to generate so much discussion. It was not just about the crime itself. It was about youth, fame, vulnerability, violence, and the uneasy way those forces can collide in a single moment. And even after the handcuffs, the hearings, and the headlines, one lingering question remained. Was this tragedy an isolated act of violence, or part of a deeper pattern that still goes unresolved today? The trial years later. The trial finally began in February 2023, nearly 5 years after the incident. That delay alone gave the proceedings a heavy emotional atmosphere. Time had passed, but nothing had truly disappeared. For the family of the victim, the years had not softened the loss. They had simply stretched it out, turning grief into something long and relentless. For the defendants, those same years had been spent in custody, waiting, preparing, and facing the reality that their fate would eventually be decided in open court. What does waiting do to justice? Does time make a verdict feel more complete, or does it only prolong the pain? Those questions hovered in the background of the trial, even when no one said them aloud. Inside the courtroom, every detail seemed magnified. The walls, the benches, the microphones, the shuffled papers, the formal language of legal procedure, it all created a setting where emotion had to coexist with evidence. Prosecutors built their case piece by piece, presenting surveillance footage, digital evidence, and witness testimony. Each piece of information worked like a thread, and together they formed a picture the state argued was impossible to ignore. Allen took the stand and described the sequence of events in detail. His testimony became one of the central pillars of the prosecution's narrative, and the courtroom listened closely as the events were reconstructed moment by moment. What did he see? What did he know? What did he choose to say after years of silence and uncertainty? In cases like this, testimony is more than a statement. It becomes a bridge between what happened and what can be proven. The defense, as expected, pushed back. They challenged aspects of the prosecution's case and attempted to introduce alternative theories. That is how adversarial trials work, each side fighting to shape the meaning of the same facts. But in this courtroom, those arguments did not gain traction. The evidence remained firm, the testimony remained central, and the jury was left to weigh the totality of what had been presented. As the closing statements ended, the atmosphere in the room changed. The attorneys had made their final appeals. The jury had heard the facts, the theories, the arguments, and the competing interpretations. All that remained was deliberation. And in a case this charged, that silence before the verdict can be almost unbearable. What must it feel like to sit in that stillness, knowing that lives on every side of the room have already been permanently altered? The verdict. After 8 days of deliberation, the jury returned its decision. All 3 defendants, Boatwright, Newsom, and Williams, were found guilty of first-degree murder and armed robbery. For the prosecution, the verdict confirmed the case they had spent years building. For the family, it represented a long-awaited legal recognition of the loss they had carried from the beginning. And for the defendants, it marked the moment when possibility gave way to final consequence. In a courtroom already thick with tension, one moment drew widespread attention. As the verdict was read, Michael Boatwright reportedly turned toward the victim's family and blew a kiss. The gesture became one of the most talked-about details of the trial, not because it was large, but because it was so jarring in such a serious setting. What does a gesture like that communicate in a moment like that? Defiance, denial, anger, or something else entirely? Was it meant as provocation, or was it a sign of how disconnected some people can become from the gravity of their own actions? Those are the kinds of questions that make a courtroom moment linger in public memory long after the transcript is filed away. For many observers, it became one of the most controversial moments of the entire trial. It was not merely a reaction, it was a symbol. A single movement that seemed to intensify the emotional distance already present in the room. In a case built on irreversible loss, that one image only deepened the public sense that this was not a story with easy emotional resolution. Sentencing and final consequences. In April 2023, sentencing was delivered, and the final legal consequences came into focus. Michael Boatwright received consecutive life sentences plus additional years tied to prior probation violations. He will remain in prison for the rest of his life. Trayvon Newsome was also sentenced to life without parole. Dedrick Williams received the same sentence. 3 individuals, 3 life sentences, no possibility of release. The judge addressed the emotional weight of the crime directly, emphasizing the irreversible consequences not just for the victim, but for his family and the wider community. That is often what sentencing does in cases like this. It translates grief into language the legal system can carry. It cannot restore what was lost, but it can formally acknowledge that the loss was profound and permanent. At the sentencing hearing, family members spoke about grief, absence, and the ache of living with a loss that never goes away. Their words underscored a truth that legal proceedings often circle around but never fully solve. Justice does not undo what happened. It only determines accountability. And even accountability can feel incomplete when measured against the finality of death. Still, for many, the sentences represented an essential answer to a question that had persisted since the night of the crime. Would anyone be held fully responsible? Would the system follow through? Would the delay between the act and the punishment weaken the outcome, or would it prove that even years later, consequences still arrive? The cooperating witness. Robert Allen, who cooperated with prosecutors, received a significantly reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony. He was sentenced to time served plus probation. His role in the case continues to spark debate. Was this justice through cooperation, or leniency granted in exchange for information? Did the system reward the truth, or did it simply trade one form of responsibility for another? This is one of the hardest ethical questions in criminal law. How do you weigh participation against assistance? How much should a person's willingness to testify matter when their name is already tied to the crime? These are not simple questions, and they are part of why criminal trials can leave behind so much moral uncertainty even after the legal outcome is settled. Allen's testimony helped shape the prosecution's case, but it also made him a complicated figure in the public imagination. Some saw cooperation as a path toward accountability. Others saw a troubling example of how the legal system sometimes makes room for one participant while imposing the harshest punishment on others. In a case already filled with emotional intensity, his role added another layer of discomfort. Aftermath and continued controversy. Even after sentencing, the case did not fully fade from public attention. Years later, reports surfaced of one of the convicted individuals violating prison rules by posting online content expressing a lack of remorse. That development reignited public discussion about accountability, rehabilitation, and whether some people ever truly reflect on the harm they caused. In the age of constant digital visibility, even prison no longer guarantees silence. A message, a post, or a leaked image can reopen an old wound in an instant. Why does that matter so much to the public? Because many people want to believe that punishment produces reflection. They want to believe that time, consequence, and confinement create at least some form of reckoning. When that does not seem to happen, the frustration becomes part of the story all over again. But perhaps the larger story extends beyond the courtroom entirely. The case became more than a criminal proceeding. It became a cultural marker, a reminder of how fame can coexist with vulnerability, and how public attention does not protect anyone from tragedy. It also reminded people how quickly online culture can turn a real human loss into a permanent subject of debate, replayed and reinterpreted over and over. Legacy and what remains. Jahseh Onfroy left behind a son, born after his death, and a catalog of music that continues to reach millions of listeners worldwide. His songs remain part of the cultural landscape, continuing to circulate across platforms, playlists, and conversations. His name still sparks reactions, memories, and arguments. For some, he remains a deeply influential artist. For others, his story is inseparable from the violence and instability that surrounded him. Can a legacy be both celebrated and mourned at the same time? In cases like this, the answer is often yes. His family and estate have worked to preserve his legacy, releasing music and maintaining his presence in the public eye. Yet there is an unavoidable reality beneath that effort. His son will grow up knowing his father through recordings, interviews, and public memory rather than through personal experience. That is an absence no release schedule, tribute, or archive can replace. And that leads to a final set of questions that this case refuses to let go of. What does justice truly look like in a case like this? Does a life sentence provide closure, or only finality without healing? And in a broader sense, what responsibility does culture bear when youth, wealth, fame, and violence intersect so closely?